You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Kaari Prehab as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Hello, Tiffany. Hello, Jenni. We're talking today about using yoga practices to support the low back. And I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. I feel like it's one that is interesting and important for a lot of people, even for people who aren't that excited about anatomy. I think we all have this sort of instinctive understanding of the importance of the spine. You know, it's literally at the core of the body. We have all of these sayings like, have a backbone or spineless. And even in yoga, we talk about only being as young as the spine is flexible. So maybe we kick the whole conversation about supporting the low back off by talking a little about our perception of the role of the low back and the importance of care for it.
Yeah, I think I'm excited about this conversation for a lot of different reasons. One, I think sometimes we get stuck in the science and the research and we lose sight of what it actually means to us. And so I'm really excited to have a more casual conversational tone to this and looking at kind of what are the things that we feel are most helpful. Of course, we have a lot of information in our trainings, but what does it mean when we start to apply it and use it? And, what are some of the helpful resources? I know for me personally, I have a history of a disc herniation, a lumbar disc herniation. It's been over a decade. It's probably been over a dozen years now. But for me, it was such a big learning curve to working with people with low back pain and lower back issues. And gosh, it's the number one reason why people go to the doctor, to any healthcare provider, but also to yoga. And so it's such a valuable resource. And I think looking at the lower back and some of these kind of tips and keys to working with the lower back can be really helpful, whether people are struggling with pain or injuries or just looking to optimize their movement and how they feel in their body. There's so many great takeaways. So I'm excited for that reason. But yeah, there's a lot of great things we'll talk about.
And Tiffany, I love what you're saying too about this concept of, as yoga teachers and movement teachers, we're very interested in the research and the kind of anatomical and the technical, the sort of textbook side of things. And of course, ultimately, all of that stuff is a really useful stepping stone from which to work with people. But at the end of the day, it's always about meeting the person in front of you wherever they're at and being able to respond to their specific context and their needs and their limitations. So I agree that it always does come back to this like experience that people are having, and we shouldn't be overly reliant on the science or the data necessarily.
And I think for me, I don't think I've ever taught a class that doesn't reference the spine and the low back in particular. Even if I'm thinking about a theme around the shoulders or around hip stability, I'm always also thinking about the back and moving it in some varied ways, because to me, it's so central to how we feel as we move through our lives that, even if the big focal point is elsewhere, it's so important to do some things that support the low back, whatever that is with the population that you're working with. And for me, I work often with older students who can have pretty long-standing or long-established patterns in their hips, in their thoracic spine. And so that little bit of investigation about what's easy, what's difficult, what planes of motion feel really natural and which feel a little less natural can be so informative to every single part of the rest of their lives outside of their yoga practice. And you've both hit on something already that I thought might come up pretty quickly. And that is that something like 80% of people experience low back pain. Like, that's such a staggering number. Why do you think that number's so high?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons which we'll look at today. I mean, one, gravity and humans now walking
Damn you,
upright
gravity.
in relationship to gravity. And I think that's a big part of it. And the lower you go on the spine, the more weight of the upper body that you're carrying around, which
Yeah.
it's designed to do. It's a brilliantly designed system, but it's still, the lumbar spine has to carry the weight of everything above it. And, the
Mm.
cervical spine, obviously the head is still large and heavy, but it's just carrying that head. And so the lower we go, the more we have to carry around. And
Mm.
when we look at the fascial research, which we won't really be talking about too much in this discussion, we also see a lot of nociceptors in that lumbar area and the thoracolumbar fascia there. So I
Yeah,
think
that
there's a
was
lot of
really
interesting
interesting.
ones.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I
that
was
was something
actually
that was not expecting to hear. That's really interesting.
I was kind of going to go there as well, because there's also this argument that low back pain specifically is like a disease of civilization, meaning it's to do with the fact that we are sitting so much and our postural
Mm.
tendencies. And um, I've heard arguments on both sides, like arguments and research both supporting and not supporting that hypothesis. But I think one thing that could be said to be true generally across the board is that um, our general population does not move nearly enough or in as broad a variety of ways as we could be moving in
Mm.
throughout the day and throughout our lives. And there's all these theories about how things like poor range of motion or poor body awareness or not having good muscular capacity, like anywhere in your body, all of that can be perceived by your nervous system as a potential source of threat. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, if you are not mobile and strong, then that would potentially inhibit your chances of survival. So just not having that capacity could predispose you to potentially having more pain in the body as kind of like a warning mechanism. So
Hmm.
I'm a big proponent of the idea that just moving more and in as many ways as possible. And Rachel, like you said, moving also in the ways that actually feel challenging or limited, which
Mhm.
are the ones that we would naturally tend to avoid, that can
Yeah.
all add up to big improvements as far as pain outcomes.
I love that you went there. That really interests me because I guess I was framing the low back in a more mechanical context, thinking, it's such a big transition zone between the lower body and the upper body. And so maybe more than anywhere else in the body, it's really subject to any disagreements in patterns and forces going on in the hips and legs versus going on in the thoracic spine and the shoulders and the head and the neck. So I love the fact that you brought in the nervous system and the way that our bodies are so intelligently designed to not just respond to mechanical load but to perceived threats and experiences. And yeah, interesting. Maybe we talk a little bit about the mechanics though. When do you think more isolated practices are helpful? When do you think more functional full body practices are helpful? Because I feel like you've mentioned that second one already.
Yeah, so I think both of those things definitely have a time and a place, and they can be really useful in different contexts. And again,
Mm.
it's going to come down to the individual. And I personally work with clients who are on both ends of the functionality spectrum, and they both benefit from all of those things in different ways. But if you have somebody who tends to be less, more sedentary, maybe doesn't have quite as good body awareness, or maybe they're even in a lot of pain and don't have a lot of confidence in their bodies about the capacity for strength, those more simple isolated movements can be really beneficial just in kind of reinforcing that neuromuscular connection, building a little bit of confidence. It's really confidence inspiring to like feel a muscle engaging that you maybe didn't know existed even.
Hmm.
So all of that can serve as a really nice stepping stone for those more functional movements, which ultimately that's in my mind where we want to go in the end. Because isolated muscular contractions is not how our brains or our nervous systems think about movement. It's much more task oriented.
Mm.
So ultimately, we want to get to a point where it's a lot more instinctive and second nature to just be able to kind of like do something without having to think through it step by step. But obviously, for many people, it's super helpful to have more of a gradual entry to these more challenging, complex movements.
And Tiffany, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, we just dove right in.
Yeah. That's how
But
we roll.
I love that we're like right into the mechanics. We don't waste any time. And I think it's a great question. This idea of like isolations versus functional movements, and how do they work together? Because I think it's really important, as Jenni said, to build some confidence, but it also creates that neurologic awareness too, and connections to help eventually translate into the more complex movements. So bringing that more isometric work and a much safer way to approach, well, not really movement, but support for the tissues there as a transition into movement is so important. We wake up that neurological control first in that isolated isometric capacity, and create a pathway for the movement to come. And then we have to be able to just slowly expand that challenge, because we have to, as Jenni said, prepare people for all sorts of different challenges and movements. Our body are made to move in every direction. And so we're only prepared for what we practice and what we do. And in order to capture that neurologic control, we have to be able to work through all these different movements. So isolations are great, but if you just do the one isolation every time, all the time, yeah, I think its capacity to be helpful could be limited, though it can still be a confidence builder. And for some people, they really like doing them, and that's great. And I'm assuming for you, Rachel, too, with senior populations, those become more and more helpful to be able to work with in a more accessible way. But eventually, with whatever population it is, we have to be able to expand past that and
Yeah,
broaden
I'm
it
really
into
glad
more
that you
complex.
both Yeah, I'm really glad that you both mentioned that, because as usual on social media, I see people get really stuck in one camp. It's only about isolation and individual detailed segmental control, or it's only about full body functional movement. But of course, the truth is it really depends on the person and the context, doesn't it? And either practice can be the perfect practice depending on who you're working with and what the background is. And yeah, I love a bit of isolated work, but I'm glad I don't rely on that completely, because if it comes down to, control of multifidus, I don't have any. So isn't it lucky that I have more full body functional movements to enjoy as well?
I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here too is that isometrics do have this analgesic effect, which can, in and of itself, be so useful if you are working with somebody who's in a lot of pain or doesn't have a lot of like trust in their body's capacity. Where by doing something like an isometric, you're actually creating this little window of opportunity that where the pain is maybe a little bit lower, and they can actually do some strengthening stimulus in that little window as well. So another really useful kind of gateway or entry point for people who are just kind of learning to use their bodies in a new way. And one other thing that I've really noticed as well is that I work with, as I mentioned, like people on both ends of the movement spectrum, including like very skilled, competent users of their bodies who are, maybe even elite or competitive athletes. And what I have really noticed is that you shouldn't underestimate the power of giving those people something really simple like an
Hmm.
isometric thing as well, because they spend a lot of like basically all of their time is spent training like power, explosivity, like faster, harder, more weight. And it can be so revelatory for them. Like they never get to experience these simpler, slow things anymore.
Hmm.
So it can be very revealing and insightful for them, and they just get to they learn another thing about their body or experience a new sensation that they maybe didn't really have access to before. So the simple stuff works really well, I think, as we've said, for many different people in many different contexts for different reasons.
And I would even say the flip side with the population that I work with, or even people who are coming out of a low back injury, don't underestimate the power of simply having them move and not really dial into the nitty gritty details of can I
Mm.
just get this segment or can I just get this muscle? So, yeah, I like the fact that we've gone in both directions.
And I just for those who aren't familiar, just just a quick little reminder too that we're talking about isometrics, which means where you're contracting the tissues without moving. versus concentric or eccentric activation. And then isolations where we're trying to target a specific muscle, which is really kind of impossible to totally isolate a muscle, but we're really trying our best to isolate a muscle. And so those are usually practices that are on the floor or very supported to help you really dial into that specific tissue. And the isometrics allow us to create that neurologic connection to the tissues without even moving. And so it's a really accessible way to get the tissues and that neurologic connection turning on, so that then again, the idea is we can connect that into movement patterns, which we don't have to stop and think about it, that it becomes an automatic process rather than having to stop and think about all these like perfect yoga cues and this perfect alignment. That ideally we have to translate that eventually into complex movements, but it's a more of an automatic thing as we progress through that. So just a quick little backpedal there.
Thank you for giving some definitions and some clarity.
Reining us in.
Yeah, got a little bit overexcited there. You've both talked about sort of confidence and making people feel a little more comfortable in their own bodies. And I think for me, this comes up with low back pain more than any other part of the body, except maybe the knees would be the second place that I hear people expressing a lot of anxiety in their language. There seems to be this real association that with the back, any kind of pain equals degeneration, equals loss of function. This kind of catastrophizing I see most often with the back than probably any other part of the body.
Yeah.
We just don't speak about it the same way as we do like the wrist or the shoulder. So why do you think that is, that it has such powerful connotations for people?
Well, in Chinese medicine, the lower back is connected to the kidneys, and the kidneys are very much that protection, that primal kind of fear and survival mechanism, which is, I think, very much related to our modern day lives, which is kind of always, there's always this comparison between hunters and gatherers always having to run for their lives. But what's interesting is a lot of people in our modern day society are constantly running from that fear-based conditioning and that sense of like, how do I find security in a world where we actually really never have security? There's this, illusion that we're going to have some security at some point. And in Chinese medicine, in the energetic body, that a lot of that correlates with the kidneys and the lower back. And interestingly enough, Rachel, also shows up in the knees.
Oh, interesting. Yes. I'm so intuitive.
The kidneys are responsible for the health of the low back and the knees from a Chinese medicine perspective. So the TCM theory. So there's one take.
Rachel, I love that you mentioned this idea of catastrophizing as well, because I think that there is some research that has shown that for people who are more likely to jump to that immediate worst case scenario in their head, that actually has an effect where it can worsen their pain or their perception of pain, however you want to think about it. And of course, a lot of the ways in which low back pain is talked about, that can be kind of pain provoking as well, from coming from that place of fear as well, just like maybe not understanding exactly what you're like, being able to interpret your MRI scan, and like a slipped disc in air quotes sounds pretty scary as well, even though that visual is not necessarily an accurate representation of what's happening in the spine. A lot of the time, I think people also underestimate their body's own capacity to adapt and to heal. And I think that many people are very invested in this notion too, that tissue damage is inevitably going to equal pain or disability, which also doesn't have to be the case either. So I think there's a lot of different things that can really drive that kind of that perception of the back pain as being kind of like this horrible end all be all thing.
And I would say those are true for all pain too. The catastrophizing being an amplifier, and how we see our education of the body, which is why we have these free podcasts here. So we can spread the word and get the message out. And, and of course, our trainings for a lot deeper immersion into, a guided process of really understanding the full complete system, which is really nice. But all of these things are influencing our pain for sure, as well as posture. Posture is such a big one. It's such a simple one. And it's so easy to kind of brush over and feel like, oh, it's posture. Or, sometimes we can either go to one extreme of just blaming it on our posture all the time and blaming everything on it. The other side of it is it's easy to feel like that's an overly simplified excuse, but it's such a big thing because we live in gravity all day long, whether you're sitting or standing. If you're laying on the ground, it's a little different. Your low back gets a little more relief when you're kind of offloading the discs and lying on your back there, or even a little bit prone. But as I'm sitting in relation to gravity or standing in relation to gravity, and then I add that poor posture, every little tiny step I lean forward or shift in different directions is influencing how the pressure settles into those discs. And like you guys said before, the discs are incredibly strong and resilient. There's always this feeling of like, oh, is it going to slip or am I going to do something wrong? But when you go and dissect this, and I know you guys have been in the cadaver labs too, you see you have to take a very sharp scalpel and put a lot of force into it.
Trigger warning, trigger warning.
Back and forth to actually get into that disc. Now, these are 90-year-old bodies, so there's not a lot of nucleus left at this point for most people, but they're strong structures, that fibrous membrane, the layers of the annulus fibrosus that surround the disc, which is what keeps that kind of jelly filling in the middle, are so incredibly strong. And so it's important to have those healthy visuals, but at the same time to recognize that because posture is the one thing we do all day, it's the most relevant when we talk about repetitive stress or irritation or whatever kind of context you want. I don't like use the wearing down of tissues because the body's resilient and it bounces back, but it's a big one.
You've pulled out a couple of things there that I'd really like to talk about in a bit more detail, and they almost contrast or contradict each other. They don't, but they have that feeling. The first one is when I first did the spine training and I saw the table of progressive load running through the lumbar discs in different body positions, blew my mind. Because prior to learning anything about anatomy, I guess I assumed that maybe back bends would be the most loading thing for the low back. And then, sitting's pretty easy. Sitting wouldn't be much load at all, and standing, So let's talk for a moment about the disc loading in different body positions and what that means. And then let's talk a little bit more about bad posture in air quotes, good posture in air quotes.
Well, I think if you just understand the basic anatomy of the spine, and if you, just Google disc or lumbar spine or something like that, you'll see it pull up. But we're all familiar with the spine on the spinous process, which is the pointy process that you can palpate on your back. We have the spinous process on the back. We have the foramen where the spinal cord goes through right in front of that. And then in front of that, we have this large bony process called the body of the vertebra, which is the largest chunk of bone there. It's hard to describe in a podcast variation, but
Google people.
This is where our illustrations and the trainings come in really handy. But if you think about the center of gravity, my weight is now centering over the back half, which is the spinal cord and the two facet joints, and the front half, which is the body of the disc. As I bend backward, I'm actually putting more weight into the facet joints, which can be problematic too, and taking weight off of the disc. So a lot of times in a traditional physical therapy realm, back bends are usually prescribed for disc issues because of that. Though I will say, in my experience, that doesn't always work that clear cut for people with disc issues. But when we fold forward, we put more weight into the discs themselves. And so again, this can be a good thing because the discs don't have direct blood supply. They get nutrients and fluids via what's called this mechanism of imbibing, which are the changes in pressure. So all of these little movements in yoga, and it doesn't need to be a lot, but all these tiny little movements of the spine when we're working around the spine here are helping to change pressure around that disc to pull fluids in to keep it plump and juicy, which is what we really want for those discs. And so when we fold forward, though, if there is irritation to the disc, or there is a problem there, or some kind of maybe herniation or a bulging disc there, I'm actually putting more pressure onto that. So it will usually magnify those symptoms, or I will feel those symptoms, versus when I bend backwards. Classically speaking, I'm not going to feel those symptoms. Though I know for myself, I remember when I had my disc herniation, I went to a very well-respected yoga teacher who I won't name, but I still have a lot of respect for, and asked them what I should do. And they said that I should do Dhanurasana. And I almost started crying because it was one of the most painful poses for me at the time, which, maybe I had some SI joint issues too. Who knows? Maybe there's other things because life is complex. But for many people, and for many of I've dealt with so many patients with disc issues and low back issues. And I find it to be pretty common actually for people to have pain with back bends as well. So it's not a cut and dry story. There's always more to the body than just the simple thing. But technically, classically, theoretically, when I fold forward, it's going to put more pressure into the disc. And when I bend backward, it's going to take pressure off of that disc.
And it's nice to know that theory, I think, and even just to understand that pressure or load doesn't equal damage. It's just like a mechanical fact, just pressure, load.
And a healthy person, those forward folds and all of the bending is just a great way to support the health of the disc and the hydration of the disc. And in a person who has disc issues, the same thing, can also be maybe a little toxic for them, for lack of a better word. And, like one person's medicine is another person's poison. And I want to have the right dosage and the right frequency of application. So, everyone's a little different, of course.
So when we kind of visualize that load, I guess what we start to imagine is the perfect scenario is weight evenly balanced between the front of the vertebra and the back, and this wonderful column of upright posture that I think people get a little bit stuck on. I know I have students come to me often kind of guilty, going, "Oh, I have the worst posture." And I'm always interested to know, like, what's your idea of right posture? Is that kind of military carriage where you sometimes even lose the natural curves of the spine because you've got this illusion of this perfect stacking? Really, the body's made to move in all kinds of shapes and planes, and the only really bad posture is the shape that you're in all the time, which just happens these days for most of us to be curled over our computers. Jenni, I can see you wanting to jump in here.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it just comes back to having a variety of different options as far as the ways in which you're able to move. So one argument is that there is no such thing as bad posture. There's only a posture that you get stuck into, and then over time you start losing access to these other postural options. And like Tiffany was saying, in a healthy spine, you are able to move in all directions, and that quote unquote stress and the good stress and the load are actually articulating through that entire range of motion is what's helping to keep the discs and the spine healthy as well. So there isn't really, and I think most people, if you are slumped at your computer, that feels kind of good for a certain amount of time until it doesn't, at which point you change something up. You get up and do a little side bend or a little twist, which we know from a technical standpoint why those are good, but I think people instinctively gravitate towards those movements because it feels like just the changing feels good. And then eventually maybe you sit really upright for a little while, and then that starts to feel not comfortable. So you change again. So just instinctively, I think people make their way in and out of different postures and shapes in a way that's really natural and healthy. And potentially pathologizing posture, which is sort of like a relatively arbitrary concept anyway, and is going to be very different from one person to the next. It's not helpful to maybe make it imply that there's a correct way and an incorrect way.
Well, and I think what you're talking about too, just to make a clear distinction here, is I mean, we're all familiar with like that really bad posture where we're leaning forward and the head's forward and the shoulders are forward and then we're like literally hunched over. But I think what we're talking about now more is the lumbar curve and, how much, how little, there's all this debate. And, a lot of times in, physical therapy realm or orthopedic realms, there's this context of a hand's width. So, a lot of times and we do this briefly as a training in our trainings because it's a good starting point, but it is literally just that very starting point of like holding a broomstick behind your back, or you can do it against the corner of a wall, the outward corner of a wall, so that it's like a stick, and that stick or the corner of the wall should land on the back of your head, the back of your ribs, and the back of your sacrum. And then when you're standing naturally, there should be about a hand's width so that you can just grab that rod behind your back, and that's considered technically, traditionally, a normal lumbar curve. And if it deviates too far in any direction, like you can't fit your hand back there, or you've got a huge hole back there, that you're more of a flat back or hyperlordosis, which I think gives us a place to start. And the whole purpose of this, I think sometimes people get too rigidly attached to that, is that we start to create this rigid figure around that. But what I'm trying to do is discern, and it gives me kind of a focal point to discern, like, does this person lean more toward this kind of rigid flat back or more toward this hyperlordosis? Like, what's their tendency, so that if I'm focusing on therapeutics, I can help them balance that. Not that I'm trying to recreate their curve or make it it may never change significantly depending on where they are in that spectrum. There's obviously extremes and subtleties here. But what I want to do is then use that. And I find it very helpful for people to use that awareness to carry into their postures. Again, not to create a rigid specific shape, but to work in a direction, so that then eventually we start to learn how to support our body's unique shapes and then take that into, again, more complex movements. So we know
I
their
couldn't
default.
agree more. Yes. Yeah. And for the population that I work with, for a lot of older people, there is a tendency for the upper body to kind of curl forward. Nobody wants to be the little old lady or the little old man in the grocery store that's bent over double. So there's definitely patterns that can be very helpful to work on that aren't even in the low back, but are higher up or lower down. And I think framing the conversation around what's your tendency, what direction do you head into naturally? How does it feel if we take it, as Jenni said earlier, a little bit in the other direction, a little bit toward the plane that feels less familiar or less comfortable? How does that feel? What does that change? And having that as a starting point for exploration, I think, can be really powerful, because posture is something that we do so unconsciously and for such long periods of time.
And by definition, our posture, whatever your default or your normal is, you might not be aware of those tendencies that you have. So I feel like a lot of it too is just developing people's awareness and their own ability to notice when they are starting to like head more in the direction of their natural tendency. So having that ability to kind of catch that is really the first step. And then, of course, it's not necessarily about quote unquote correcting that, but just giving them more options.
Yes.
And things might change over time. I know mine's changed quite a bit over time. And it wasn't necessarily my goal, because again, this is just the starting point. It's not a rigid structure, but it's meant to move, and it's meant to express all of these different shapes. And so I find for the people who tend to be more on the flat back scenario, it's more giving them permission to soften a little bit and find more of that curve that we tend to, as a community, try and flatten out. We're like more core work, more
Tuck
support,
the tailbone,
right? Tuck the tailbone. Yeah. Versus the people who are hyperlordotic is trying to find that subtle support and lift, so they're not laying in their joints and laying in the back, and finding a way to support them, where they're at. We're, in a group class, I think we can all benefit from a little bit of both of those.
Yeah. And I think too, this kind of fits to me in the same sort of space of conversation as the isolation versus full body, more functional movement. For me personally, it was really helpful to create a little bit more rigidity around my postural habits and patterns, because my tendency was to be kind of slack and sloppy and hang out in my joints, and going through a phase of having the dowel stick behind my back, finding my curves, recruiting a little bit more support from my core and my legs, and then transitioning so that there was a little bit less being done by my back and a little bit more being done by my core and legs, was such helpful repatterning. Doesn't mean I have to keep the dowel stick behind me for the rest of my life, thank goodness. But for a time, that was such a helpful practice.
Totally. And I'll echo that for my disc herniation. I mean, I think that's a very important initial phase. There's a lot of other tools too. So it's not like if you're not doing that, it's everything. But for me, that was such a big part of it. And especially someone being super more on the flexible side, having that stability and support as someone, like you mentioned, who tended to lay in her joints and be more flexible, help to welcome that as well. And there's so many great ways to do this. I know, on Yoga Medicine Online, Jenni was mentioning the thoracic work, I think, is such a big part. Like, so we can look at the stick and stabilizing the lumbar spine, but if our thoracic spine isn't mobile and moving well, the whole thing is a continuum. So if one part gets locked down, the other parts around it have to move more. And so all this thoracic spine work is so great to free up the thoracic spine and take some pressure off that lower back. I think people overlook that part.
So we've, I think, started to shift gears to talk about practices that we find helpful, which is great. This is probably why many people are listening to the podcast. So we've talked about recruiting a little bit more support from the core. And I think often we just think about like a kind of six-pack core. So maybe we unpack what we mean by core and legs, and then thoracic mobility. And maybe I'll start with Tiffany, and then Jenni, talk about some of the practices that you find the most helpful, those and others.
Well, I feel like we talk about subtle core so much in yoga medicine. I feel like
I just feel like you can't say it too much. Yeah, because I think some people still immediately think rectus abdominis, six-pack muscle, as soon as you say core. I think you can't explain it enough.
Yeah, the TVA, the transverse abdominis, is such an interesting one, which, one of the ways I really love to train this one is Kapalabhati, our breath of fire. It's a really nice way to train transverse abdominis. And there's some other subtle ways, a lot, which we plant in both in the spine training as well as on Yoga Medicine Online. And I've got a whole low back series, which is meant for people with pain, that starts off with more subtle stuff around the TVA and postural awareness and MFR and meditations, and kind of guides you through that more complex training and support. And you don't have to have pain, but if you want to work progressively through that support, but that transverse abdominis that you see a lot if you practice with us is really just that subtlety of tuning into this very thin layer. If you dissect a body, it's the hardest. It's one of the hardest part to dissect because it's so thin within that abdominal wall. But its main function is just to draw the contents of the abdomen in toward the spine so that it can move more effectively and efficiently. So it's not dependent on movement, which means that we can engage it subtly. It's a very subtle muscle throughout all these ranges of motion as a supportive mechanism. And it's made to be mobile. It's not made to be rigid and tense the whole way through, but it's made to turn on when we step up the challenge, and made to turn off to also allow us to breathe more easily too.
I love that you mentioned Kapalabhati in that context, because that kind of helps people on both ends of the spectrum. The people who have trouble allowing the abdomen to soften, our culture is very pro stomach, you could bounce a coin off. So letting it soften for some people can be the hard part of the practice. For other people, it's that sense of hugging in or cinching in. So I love that it does both.
Yeah. It's one of my favorites. I love it.
So what are the practices in the
Jenni,
list of helpful things?
Well, you mentioning the abs that you can bounce a quarter off of actually made me think of the fact that having this rigidity in the anterior core in a lot of the athletic population is something that I wouldn't call it problematic, but it's definitely a tendency, especially for, like CrossFitters, people who are doing a lot of like ab and core work in general. And that can have all kinds of trickle down effects where, taking a deep breath becomes kind of difficult because the actual musculature of the belly is so rigid, and they are often taught to like brace in anticipation of movement with heavy loading, which of course also makes sense. But that kind of brings it back around to like, well, what is the context of the individual, and what kind of function, what kind of load do we need them to tolerate, and in what positions and in what scenarios? And I think if you kind of take this zoomed out approach and start to think of like bracing is one thing, being able to resist movement is one thing, but then we also want that ability to articulate freely. And people are potentially going to lean more towards one side of the spectrum versus the other, depending on what their activities are and their personal anatomy. So we just want to kind of balance out wherever they land on that scale to a comfortable middle ground. And of course, make sure that they have the function that they need to perform in daily life, like feel good in daily life, and then in whatever other activities they want to do. And I feel like there's this kind of big ongoing debate as well about, if somebody does have low back pain, is it about like stiffening and creating rigidity and support and bracing, or is it more about articulating? And in my mind, those two things are kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're both part of the equation. And the whole bottom line is just to get people to move in a way that feels good and functional to them. So I know that doesn't really answer the question of like, what are the favorite practices or poses? Because I just took it to such a like broad view.
Well, when I think it articulates that the subtlety is important, because we want to be able to use it through all these different realms. Like people tend to focus on the crunches or the sit-ups and the core, which we know, I think as a society, we have this connection of, oh, I have low back pain, so I'm going to do core work. But I can't tell you how many people I've seen, some are athletes, some are not, who have these beautiful six-pack abs, who have a lot of back pain. And so it doesn't translate into something that's functional unless we learn how to use our core in all of these different dimensions and movements and diversity of experiences on our mat and challenges. Just doing crunches doesn't really translate to, it's helpful a little bit. It's not ultimately awful all by itself. We don't need to throw it out completely, but it doesn't really translate into a lot of functional movement in our lives. When are you?
Yeah. And for the population I work with, that can be the least helpful pattern for somebody who has a lot of rounding in their thoracic spine. The last thing I want to do is to get them pull their rib cage closer to their pubic bone. But lots of ways to play with that subtlety, to get taller, and to look at the rest of the core too, like the QL on the sides of the waist and the erectors on the back of the body, to kind of see the core as this three-dimensional structure, as well as thinking about the diaphragm on the inside, everything.
When we take away that limit of thinking of the core as abdominals, the abdominal wall, we start to see that the core is really just the center of the body. And when we're looking at it in a biomechanics context, we always look upstream and closer to the center of the body, which could be the core muscles, but it could also just be the spine in general and everything around it. So it's all important.
Yeah.
I heard another very interesting theory, or kind of just idea about whether core stiffening exercises in general, again, very much going to be context dependent, but if you have somebody that has low back pain, and part of that could be that their range of motion just isn't good in general. If they're already kind of stiff, then do we want to give them more stiffening exercises in the form of like bracing? And sort of coming back to this idea that inadequate range of motion can in and of itself be like a nervous system based driver of pain, like just not having that freedom to move. And which isn't to say that core strengthening or bracing exercises are worthless. They're just not going to be the solution in every scenario.
Yeah, I think that's where we're really coming to when we're talking about helpful practices. It's really going to vary based on the person or the people that we're working with. But the end result that we're looking for is this really beautiful balance of free mobility in all directions and the capacity to create support and to add not structure, but yeah, to add support to this really mobile transition zone of the body.
And to be able to meet the demands of the task at hand, like whatever it is, just having that all the capabilities on deck, where depending on what it is that you need to do, your musculature, like your musculoskeletal system and your nervous system are just like, cool, got it, we're doing this.
And I think that's the context, right? And I think a lot of times in a yoga context, in fitness and weightlifting, when we talk about that bracing, it's a very different story. But in a yoga setting, I think it's pretty rare that we need that really intensive bracing mechanism in a yoga setting. Now, maybe we're exaggerating it, especially if someone has a disc issue or something going on where movement is. I mean, I remember there was a point in my disc injury where just moving around was a really challenging task. Just simple things that we take for granted. And so, there's always a place. And like Jenni said, I think it's a big context dependent question too. And kind of brings us to some of the poses too that, can be helpful or not helpful. And I think it also depends on the context. I know for me, one that I've always avoided ever since, it's been a long time now, and it's not that I don't do it, is Bird of Paradise, because of what we talked about with the loading of the discs. The more we start to fold forward, and then if we carry weight and fold forward, I mean, obviously we can meet the challenge, we can teach ourselves to do it, but it's such an awkward scenario to come up in. And I see so many people doing it and grimacing, thinking that it's going to be helpful, but I'm not throwing it out completely.
I mean, it's such a great Instagram profile shot. You can't throw it out completely.
I just always assume that in any given group class, there's at least a few, if not a large portion of the class that has some lower back issues or history of lower back issues that may or may not have been dealt with. And,
or who just don't have the range of motion to get into a shape like that.
Well, it's the coming up part. That's the hard part on the back, which may or may not mean you extend the leg at all. Like you could just bend it, and it's still quite a bit of range of motion to get your leg back behind your shoulder though.
Yeah.
So basically, when we're talking about things that you're more mindful of, the first one that came to your mind, Tiffany, was transitioning from one shape to another, especially from a weighted forward fold, which is essentially what Bird of Paradise is, coming up from a forward fold, holding the weight of your leg.
Yeah. And then another version for people who are, again, on the more painful spectrum of lower back issues is, when we're going forward in a sun salute, keeping the arms up overhead, because now I've got the weight of my arms up overhead versus taking them by my sides. Again, I'm not saying that there's not a useful place for all of these things. These all present a useful challenge in the right place and context and person. But yeah, and that the transitions are usually where we tend to have a tough time, like stepping forward from down dog and coming up to crescent. Again, things you might take for granted if you've never had a back injury, which is great. Our backs are resilient. They're made for those things. They're not ultimately bad or wrong. But sometimes we have to slow down and relearn how to move with support.
And I think especially in group yoga classes, like flow-based classes, the transitions often are not necessarily glossed over, but it tends to be a pretty quick inhale, lift your leg, exhale, step it through. When for somebody who does have a spinal issue, that could actually be incredibly challenging to do that. But we don't really give that transition the same amount of cueing or time in the context of what's supposed to be a dynamic movement class, to really kind of modify it.
And rightfully so, right? As yoga teachers, I don't think the burden's on us to do everything for everyone in a group class. Like where there's an assumption that you're able to move fairly freely, because I do think it's hard. Sometimes there becomes a bad rap on these things that teachers should be cueing more in certain things. And I do think it's great to break down transitions from time to time. I think everyone can benefit from that. But I know as a yoga teacher, I can't teach that every time. People get sick of me saying it. Plus there's less time, right?
Yeah.
That's what I was going to chime in and say, that every now and again, spending a whole class focusing on mindful transitions is such a powerful thing. And you can just hope that enough of the students come back that they keep that skill set in their repertoire. But, you don't have to teach anything every single class. Imagine how boring your classes would be.
And how long they'd be.
Yeah. 7 hours later, we haven't made our way forward from downward facing dog to anywhere.
Another one is twists. I think twists are a sensitive group of poses because, again, if people have issues with the disc, it is putting more pressure on the disc in the twist. That doesn't necessarily mean they're like something we want to throw out completely, though, because that twisting mechanism is also shifting pressure through the disc and helping to imbibe. So the trick is really making them gentle enough that I'm not feeling like, I know when I had my disc issue and worked with other people who have disc issues, sometimes they can be very comfortable in the twist and the pain is when they come out. And so, being conscious of not only the during, but the after effect and approaching them with appreciation that we don't always need a lot. We want to keep pushing and going deeper because we think we're going to get more out of it. But just these small changes, even just a tiny little twist in that spine is shifting the pressure around the disc, which is helping to draw fluids into it. So, and the beautiful thing about that is when I lay on the ground and do it, I'm offloading the spine. And so I get a really nice approachable version, like a windshield wiper of the knees or something. There's so many
That's
different.
exactly where I found that table so helpful to kind of figure out if I want the benefits of movement, where could I do that with less load? Where could I do that with more load? Just kind of understanding. And for me, what it changed fundamentally was seated poses, which I had
hold
never
on.
thought
She's
of.
talking about the table of, just so that they know before you get into it, of the different pressures. So in our manual, we have like amount of pressure in different positions, standing versus slightly folding versus folding halfway versus folding and carrying weight versus sitting and folding and twisting. And anyways, yeah, sorry.
And you can get into details over side lying versus lying face down versus lying on your back. But it, to me, was a really helpful way to kind of unpack the benefits of poses and kind of figure out, especially when working with people one-on-one, how can I access the benefits of that pose with a little less load or, a little more load, depending on who the person was. And for me, it really did make me rethink seated postures that were so ubiquitous in yoga practice for the population. For the population I teach, seated twists, seated forward folds, a seated forward fold with a twist, a seated forward fold with a side bend and a twist might not be something I do a lot of, or might not be something I do in every class.
Well, but with the senior population, we actually see more. It's actually pretty rare for them to have herniated discs or bulging discs. It's actually more common for them to have degeneration in the discs, which, they may still be, pain is, a more complex topic, but they may still be experiencing pain in those positions, which is important to listen to regardless of the diagnosis. But in general, I think can be more approachable in some ways for them than like the middle-aged population, 30 to 30, young middle-aged, 30 to 50 population.
No, I hear you. The thing that becomes important with disc degeneration is I can't assume that somebody who's 70 has the same range of motion that they had when they were 20.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, which I think leads us to this other group of poses on back bends, which, so have so much presence in social media and pictures online, which is wonderful. They, they maybe inspire us. Maybe they, stir up certain feelings in the imagery of openness and release in them, or maybe they stir up other feelings. But, I think the reality is a lot of, and maybe I'm biased, but a lot of that is genetics. I know for myself, I've never been a great backbender and there was only so much I could ever accomplish because, there are limitations that each of us have and everyone has a different predisposition. Like maybe you're really great at forward folds or twists or crow pose or very specific postures or but some of it is important to remember that is our bony structure and our predisposition, which is really interesting. When you look deeper at the spine, you can really see why and how that happens.
I can see Jenni nodding emphatically. Back bends, not your favorite?
I mean, I personally don't have a lot of backbending range of motion either. And I think especially in a group class setting, it probably sounds really obvious, but I think just giving people permission to explicitly do less and not push or need to compare themselves to the person next to them, and having them understand that there are these bony structures that could potentially limit how far they can go. And almost even going back to this, what Tiffany was just talking about with, if you do have a disc issue and how twisting to one side might be really painful compared to the other side, and giving people very explicit permission to not have to feel like they're doing everything symmetrically necessarily. So yeah, I think that there are ways in which we can somewhat tailor the practice to the individual, even within the context of a group class setting, although it's obviously more challenging to give really individual cues. And I think for the people that do tend more towards stiffness, especially if that stiffness is going to be more focused around the thoracic spine, then just making sure that they're not overusing their cervical and their lumbar spines to get into those back bends too. So just finding a little bit of freedom of movement in that more stiff portion of the spine, and maybe thinking about distributing the back bend more evenly throughout the column of the spine.
Which I think is easier said than done. I love that people say that, like, that C shape thing.
Yeah, the C shape.
Like, but when you're coming into like Dhanurasana and grabbing your toes and coming up, there's no way to control that other than just like not letting your head drop back and crank back. So, I think there's sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. And you never know too, by looking at a picture online, whether someone feels good in that pose where they just made to do it and it feels great for them. And that's their pose. Like, I know I come into Dhanurasana, I barely lift up off the floor, and, you might look at it and be like, oh, that looks like she's in pain, but I actually really enjoy it now. Finally, I didn't used to, as I mentioned. So we don't know how they feel in it. There can also be some people who are really, like Jenni said, pushing themselves into these shapes and feel awful during or after. And, I think it just depends. I know for myself in the just prior to my herniation, I was doing a lot of Ashtanga, and I lived in New York at the time. And I was also running in Central Park because I lived right by Central Park, and I loved running in the park, which the two don't really go together because I was doing third series at the time. And there's a lot of mobility work in that. And I remember the teacher coming by, and, at the end, you do your back bends, and he somehow managed to walk my hands into my ankles on wheel pose, which I don't freaking know how that happened because I don't have a bendable back. But I remember him saying to me afterwards, this is a circle of energy. And now that you've completed it, you have to do this every time. And I was like, fuck. Are you kidding me? I was about to like cry and go home and be done with yoga. But, everyone's so different. For me, like, he had no idea. He hadn't worked with me that long. He had no idea that wasn't a normal thing for me. I don't even know how he got me in.
I don't know that that's a normal thing for anybody.
For most people.
That was my greatest back bend accomplishment. It's all downhill from there.
No, I'm someone who loves back bends, but I still think words are so powerful. And the same way that you said you were inwardly reeling when he said, now you have to do this every time. I remember being in a power vinyasa class, and the teacher said, if you can, then you must. And I was like, oh man, no.
Same thing. It's kind of the same.
I couldn't disagree more, because I can do Dhanurasana or bow pose, and I can do an overhead bind and catch my foot, but not every day. Doesn't feel good every day. Some days it feels wonderful. Some days it feels terrible. So I would say the absolute opposite of now you have to do it every time, or if you can, then you must. Like every day is an exploration.
Yeah.
And isn't it about listening to your body, just accepting that it's not going to be the same every day as well? I feel like that should be,
I think it comes from a good place. It's, this
totally
dedication and diligence.
Yourself.
Especially as we get older, it's easier to like become a little lazier as we're sitting. And I know for me, on my computer all day, and then you just have to like get yourself up. But it's also that balance of contentment. I think when we come back to that initial philosophy of yoga, even just the yamas and the niyamas, the very basic foundations of it, we find a lot of guidance in there. It's easy to get lost, but I think the back bends are such a great portrayal of that, I need to be able to find that support, and maybe that's backing out. Like I really had to step away from back bends for a long time in order to build a relationship with them. And now I actually do enjoy them. They don't look great. They're not like the prettiest, you wouldn't take a photo of them, but
I've seen pictures of you in
I
back
love
bends
it.
that look pretty impressive.
Maybe
they're old pictures.
But I enjoy how I feel in my body during the day now. Like I feel so much better than I ever did in my 30s or even my late 20s, when I was really pushing my body into these postures and getting the most out of it on my mat, and then leaving and not feeling as good. Versus now, I'm like, oh, I don't really care that, I'm not doing these fancy back bends because I feel good when I leave my mat.
I think you've hit on the absolute, go for it, Jenni.
Yeah, really fine line between like productively challenging yourself or pushing a little bit versus just pointlessly torturing yourself in a way that then ends up costing you later.
That's a really good way of putting it. That should be a quote.
And I feel like too, you've really hit the absolute essence of back care or supporting your back. And you could apply this to any joint in the body. It's less about how you feel on the mat, although of course that information is important, and it's more about what that does for you in the entire rest of your life. And for some of us, that will mean thoracic mobility practices. For some of us, that'll mean more awareness of where our head and our neck are. For some of us, it'll mean core support or recruiting more power from the legs. It's going to be such an individual journey, but our measure of success is, how do I feel when I'm walking around in my day?
Yeah. And everyone's so different. I think the other thing with back bends is that a lot of people, most of us, if we're practicing regularly, will plateau after a year or two, and so if you're having pain in your back, obviously you might need a more specific plan and approach to it with maybe a therapeutic specialist or something who can help you. But if you're not having back pain, as Rachel said, kind of exploring the things that work for you, that feel most helpful for you, and looking for the blind spots, looking for the things that are challenging, whether that's strength or mobility, what is challenging, because that's the opportunity for growth. It's in those challenges rather than, like, pigeon's always been easy for me and I can probably fall asleep in it even if I wanted to, but it's probably not that helpful for me. So, finding something else that might be helpful, maybe lifting up in pigeon or, doing something slightly different. So the challenges, I think, are the opportunities for growth. But again, it's that healthy challenge, like without torturing ourselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think even when it comes down to cues, that there aren't correct cues and incorrect cues. It really all comes down to the context. And for me, the C curve in the spine was a super helpful cue, not because I'm actually expecting my spine to make that shape, but because for me, it really did remind me, oh yeah, that feeling of zipping up the belly and using the strength of my legs and lifting through the base of the skull makes the back bend feel really different to just going as deep as I possibly can. That's it. And I think that's the challenge with a lot of the little glib things that we see thrown around, like you're only as young as your spine is flexible, because it's partially true. We do want a nice, juicy, well-hydrated, mobile spine, but you don't want to be a baby. So you don't want to have a spine that's just flopping about. You need the appropriate level of structure and support. That was a slightly random analogy.
The baby. I love it. And I think we've mentioned this a couple of times too, and maybe some people listening might not understand it, but that C curve is this idea of when you're going into a back bend, that it's a continuous curve, like a C, rather than bending in chunks or at certain hinge points there. And so I think one area we haven't talked about that I find to be one of, honestly, if you have back pain, it's probably the easiest advice that I can give you in a very simple way is using your feet and your legs. I find this all the time. I have so many patients and students that I've worked with over the years, so many of them with lower back pain. And I would say 90% of them or more tend to walk on their legs like they're sticks, like they're disconnected from them. And I had to learn this too. I know, because I came from an Ashtanga background where there's not a lot of leg strength. There's a lot of hip flexibility, but there's not a lot of leg strength in it. And I really had to work on it. It was such a big part of my recovery too, of learning how to connect with my feet and legs rather than just being like sticks underneath me that I'm kind of balancing on top of, really interacting with the floor, from down dog, you step forward and you really feel your foot push into the floor which turns on the whole leg. And so sometimes when I have people asking me about it in group classes, I'll say, like, just use your legs so much that that's the thing, regardless of what we do in class, that's the thing that gets tired first or is sore in a good way tomorrow, because you've been using it so much. Because so many of us tend to just lay into those erector spinae muscles and the muscles of the back instead of really using our legs as a community working together. We're stronger together, right? Than just laying on those back muscles. So for me, that's a huge one for a lot of reasons, but that's the succinct one.
I really agree with that, because I think sometimes we get carried away with language like, bend your knees to protect your back. And it's not really about that at all. It's just using the structures of the body the way they were designed. Legs are big and strong. They're meant for moving. They're meant for lifting. Doesn't mean you have to bend your knees every time you lift something heavy, but use the body the way that it was designed is kind of how I think about it.
The problem
So
is they're
you're
big,
wanting-
powerful
totally
muscles.
agree.
So they
Yeah,
take a lot of
exactly.
energy. So it's easy
actually,
to just
when
be
you-
like,
when you really isolate the legs in that way as well, that I have found it to be quite a revelatory experience, even for my more functional, like very trained clients. So that tends to, when they make that connection in their head, then I think that can be a real light bulb moment, even for people who aren't necessarily weak or even experiencing back pain.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked about a whole heap of things that I think people will find really helpful, because certainly I have through the course of my life of really tapping into the strength of your feet and your legs, using your core, but not that necessarily the six-pack contraction, but the three-dimensional deep to superficial front, sides, back of the core, being aware of more mobility in the thoracic spine, the part of the spine that attaches to the rib cage, and our posture in general. And then really embracing movement, moving in all directions in lots of varied ways, and not getting too fixed or stuck in any patterns, even if they're air quotes good patterns. What else would you two like to add to sort of start wrapping
I
things
think
up?
there's so much more to it. I think that's such a good introduction. A lot of the things you mentioned, the legs, the subtle core work, the importance of imbibing, and like how just offloading the spine can do that to some extent. So just supine work, like in supported restorative postures where there's not much movement happening in the spine, can be really helpful, because I'm offloading the spine and just taking pressure off of it, and lying supine is one way of imbibing too. That's why when we wake up in the morning, we're actually a little taller, because our discs have imbibed and there's a little more fluid there, and we are actually a little bit taller. So, I think all of these things can be really helpful. MFR is a really great tool for working with that. We know that low back thoracolumbar fascia around the low back, some of the low back muscles there can be a really nociceptive rich tissue, meaning it can be a tissue that also transmits signals that can be turned into pain.
She said very carefully.
But I think generally starting with, more offloaded positions like we started with, isometric movements, so just contracting without movement there, to then expand the challenge over time, and making sure that we are challenging ourselves at some point and expanding that movement as a way to challenge, because, also just being sedentary is not a helpful thing either,
I would argue as well that that continuum that you just described, it works the other way as well. So even for people who are more capable, and maybe not even in pain necessarily, don't underestimate the power of the really simple stuff, because it's so good to come back to. Even the sort of gentle movement work, which might be totally different from anything else that they do, myofascial release, all of that. It's activating different things that all have value, kind of, that more subtle awareness, the proprioceptive awareness, becoming more aware of the deep stabilizers, which are very tied into our perception of pain as well.
And we talked about this on the fascia as a sensory organ episode a little bit, so I'm not going to talk into detail on it, but I think also just slowing down and listening is such a great way to modulate pain, because now my body's taking in more information, which is also then competing with some of that nociceptive information in the spinal cord with that through that enhanced body awareness. So collecting proprioceptive information and sensory information is such a great way to help regulate pain. So it doesn't always have to be fancy as well. The simple stuff is powerful.
I would say the simple stuff is, from a pain management perspective, is extremely important.
Mm. And you've kind of pulled in some other things as well, that even though we've spent a bit of time today talking about the back kind of mechanically, there's of course going to be lots of influence from the central nervous system and from the fascial system, and even breathing can have a big influence on the low back with some of the people that I work with. So there's always more to learn.
Stress, sleep, nutrition, mental health, the energetic body. Oh my gosh, there's always so much more. And of course, I always just think it's a good reminder too, that if you are working with pain or injuries, it's so helpful to have someone who specializes in working with those to work with. That's why we have our therapeutic specialists online for you to check in with. And it's nice too, because even if there's not one in your area, you can grab someone online, and we have a nice resource for that. So it's always helpful to be able to individualize it, because everyone is so different. We're talking about broad generalities that apply to a lot of people. However, each person is so unique in their bony structure, in their soft tissues, in their nervous system, in their genetics, in their environment they grew up in, and what they do now day to day. Are they sitting all day? Are they, there's so many different moving parts that it really is helpful to have someone. My low back series is a great kind of general place to start, but it's definitely not a one size fits all. It's just the things that I've found most helpful working with hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people with lower back pain over the years, the things that I personally have found with my own back, as well as with patients and students that I've worked with. And all of it is very accessible. So I do think it's a nice way to look at it. However, nothing beats the expert eye of working one-on-one with a therapeutic specialist. So that could be a resource.
Yeah. And even if that's just to help you figure out how you can fine tune public classes or online classes to meet you where you're at. Just, it doesn't even have to be an ongoing relationship, but just what's going to be more helpful for me, what's going to be less helpful for me. Just having that knowledge in our back pockets as students can be really empowering and kind of free up a whole range of practices for us to enjoy. Yeah, you've got a couple of classes on. Oh, go for it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like, I think a lot of the classes that we have on yoga medicine online, you can almost treat them as like a menu of options that you can pick and choose things from that end up being really effective and working super well for you. And then having those tools, that kind of personalized toolkit of different techniques that work for you, is something that you can apply more broadly to movement practices and other classes as well. So I think just developing, it's such a worthwhile investment of time to really figure out the intricacies of how your own body works, so that you can make those intelligent decisions about how you're moving and practicing in other contexts as well.
Amen to that, 100%. Tiffany.
And I just want to end with a little kind of reminder that the gravity is unavoidable. We're not going to crawl around, right? So the other side of it, though, is that our spine is resilient. It's made to deal with these stressors. It's made to bounce back. Like, the discs don't just slip out of place. Like, they are very well supported in there. They're very strong. And also that I can also recover a lot of my mobility. Obviously there's some populations that this isn't totally true, especially if they have machinery like disc fusions or vertebral fusions, or if they have bone spurs, as you might see in kind of later stage osteoarthritis. But for the most part, we can recover a lot of that mobility. Will we be able to touch our feet to our head in a back bend? maybe not. That might depend on your genetics. And chances are, if you weren't fairly close to it when you started yoga, it may not. If you were far away from it, it's probably not going to happen. And that's okay. I think we need to make peace with it. It's beautiful to appreciate that other people can do those things and that maybe they enjoy those things and that I don't need to enjoy those things or be able to do those things, and I can still enjoy yoga and really be able to support the fact that my body's constantly changing. And our job in yoga is simply to grab the steering wheel through this mindfulness to be able to steer that change so that it becomes productive change. And to be able to start to disidentify with the diagnosis and be able to identify with our experience and our capacity to support the body and steer these changes that can be so potent and powerful, especially if we're able to be patient and supportive over time. So there's so much opportunity there for growth, for students, for teachers. And, obviously in our full spine training, we've got tons of details in there, which isn't necessary as a student. Like, you don't need all that. Be in your body, find a good teacher, or use our online programs on Yoga Medicine Online or whatever you like. But if you do want to learn deeper and really understand the what, why, and how behind how the spine works, rather than just being told a cookie cutter group of poses that will help lower back pain, which will only work in a certain group of people.
And if it does work, you might not understand why it works.
Yeah, that was exactly how I was going to kind of sum up the whole conversation, that if you really want to nerd out and dive deep, the spine, anatomy, dysfunction, and application yoga teacher training is awesome. I got a lot of benefit out of it personally and for the students that I work with. You can also dive into Yoga Medicine Online. There's lots of menu options that help you fine-tune your search for spine or lumbar or low back or thoracic or leg strength or foot and leg awareness. Lots of options to dive into, but don't underestimate the power of just getting curious in your own practice, noticing how things feel during, and maybe even more interestingly, noticing how they feel in the rest of your life after. So maybe any final thoughts to wrap up?
I think that was perfect. I love the curiosity. It's such a powerful tool. And ultimately, even those of us who are teachers are also students. We learn from our own experience and then we share that with others. We do the best that we can. There's always more to learn. It's always a journey. There's never an end to that. So I hope you enjoy experimenting and getting curious.
Jenni, any final thoughts?
Oh gosh, well, I feel like we've covered so much, but I think in general, just, moving often in as many different ways as possible and approaching all of it with a really kind of open-minded headspace as well, so that you can be constantly in that learning mode where you're really attuned to whatever is coming up, and just always adding more to that, your user's guide to your own body, adding more pages to that manual with everything that you're picking up and learning along the way. And that's really the best way. Having that awareness from which to start is what empowers you to then make the change and grow and evolve from there.
And if you know anyone who is in pain, send them to that low back series. Seriously, there's so many great nuggets in there. I just wish I had something like that when I had mine. So we hope you enjoy.
Lots of juicy information in there for people to tease out and explore and play with. So thank you so much, Tiffany. Thank you so much, Jenni. Thank you for listening, everybody out there in the world.
We packed it in. Thank you. Enjoy.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.